Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Forced Migration and Historical Trauma. It was organized by Professor of English at TU, Jennifer Aierey. Jennifer's field of concentration is restoration and 18th century British literature. Her first book was published in 2012, titled The Politics of Rape, Sexual Atrocity, Propaganda Wars, and the Restoration Stage. She is currently working on a new book project, Religion Around Mary Shelley, which examines Shelley's beliefs across the length of her career. Please help me welcome Dr. Jennifer Aierey.
Thank you all for coming to Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Forced Migration and Historical Trauma, which is sponsored by Titan, the University of Tulsa Institute of Trauma, Adversity, and Injustice. I am one of the Titan co-directors. Titan is an interdisciplinary institute whose co-directors come from history, English, nursing, psychology, and law, but we are all committed to studying responses to and effects of trauma and injustice in society and culture. In organizing this panel, we have sought to bring that interdisciplinary lens to the question of intergenerational trauma and its relationship to migration. I need to preface this by saying that unfortunately Mimi Marton can't be with us today, but for a good reason, that her first grandchild is about to be born, so that's nice. So I'm going to introduce all three of our panelists. They'll each give their presentations, and then hopefully we can save questions for the end. So we'll begin with a presentation from Dr. Lisa DeMarney Cromer, who will be speaking on intergenerational transmission of trauma, how violence in the home and how caregiver trauma can impact child behavior. Dr. Cromer is a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychology at the University of Tulsa. Her clinical research focuses on building resilience to adversity and trauma. Dr. Cromer works with diverse populations who experience extreme stress and has particular interest in the prevention of intergenerational transmission of trauma. She applies betrayal trauma theory to historical trauma and emphasizes the important role of enculturation and conscious awareness in healing from the past. In 2012, she was awarded the American Psychological Association's Trauma Division Early Career Award for outstanding accomplishments in trauma psychology. Dr. Cromer will offer us a theoretical understanding of the concepts of historical trauma and intergenerational transmission of trauma and consider factors related to resilience and healing. Secondly, we'll hear from Meredith Pearson, who will be presenting on the traumatic impacts of migration on a contemporary population, Burmese refugees in Oklahoma. Meredith is a second-year doctoral student in the clinical psychology program at the University of Tulsa. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Mississippi State University, graduating summa cum laude. She is passionate about community and school-based research, particularly in regard to how children develop and interact with their environments. She recently completed a needs assessment of Burmese refugees who attend Jenks Public Schools. This study, which she will be discussing today, aimed to identify barriers to education and student well-being to better inform school outreach programs, improve parent-teacher relationships, and promote student success. Her presentation is entitled, Burma to Oklahoma, Needs Assessment in Refugees in Public Schools. Finally, we will hear from Dr. Candessa Tehee, who is Assistant Professor of American Indian Studies and Coordinator for Cherokee Language Education and Cherokee Cultural Studies programs at Northeastern State University. Prior to joining NSU, she worked as the Executive Director of the Cherokee Heritage Center in Park Hill, Oklahoma, and has previously served as the manager of the Cherokee Language Program at Cherokee Nation. She earned a doctorate in linguistic anthropology, a master's in education, and an undergraduate degree in Native American Studies and Communications at the University of Oklahoma. In addition to these academic pursuits, she currently serves as the treasurer for the Southeastern Indian Artists Association and is an artist herself who works primarily in finger weaving, loom weaving, and twining. She is deeply engaged with community language efforts and regularly consults with Indigenous nations regarding language revitalization. She is also a full-blooded citizen of the Cherokee Nation and stays actively engaged with cultural traditions. Her presentation, entitled Removal and Resilience, Contemporary Southeastern Indian Art Confronts Histories of Forced Migration, will discuss artistic engagements with and means of coping with cultural and intergenerational trauma. Thank you.
thank you for having me here today. It's really an honor to be part of this symposium. I will be scratching the surface when we start to talk about historical trauma and the intergenerational transmission of trauma, as well as resilience. My hope is to give you a foundation for distinguishing between these concepts, because I think it's quite important when we think about healing and mechanisms for healing. Before I talk about theory, I'd first like to just acknowledge that I have a fabulous lab of grad students and undergrad students, and without them and these smiling faces and their hard work, none of the work that I do would be possible. So I just think it's important to acknowledge them. Devin Barlin, one of my grad students, is here today. So historical trauma is different than intergenerational transmission of trauma, and I'm going to relate this to resilience and how it relates to healing, which will, I hope, lead into the next two talks as part of this panel. So when we first look at how historical trauma reached the psychological literature, it was definitely with the notion of finding a way of healing and a pathway for healing. When we look at what falls under the umbrella of historical trauma, it would include genocide, slavery, forced migration, destruction of culture, including language. Historical trauma may not just be historical, so we can think about this from a collective perspective. And so the panel earlier today was talking about how this is happening in the present time, in the current history, and the recent past. And so we can think about historical trauma as mass trauma that is cumulative towards a group because of some aspect of their identity. So when we look at the healing from historical trauma, the healing, theoretically, from historical trauma will be at that mass collective level, that will be about reconnecting with culture and community when we want to heal wounds. This will include narratives and storytelling. It'll include art. So we have an aspect of going back when we talk about historical trauma. We're thinking about recapturing identity, purpose, pride in our culture. So this is really about interconnectedness. You certainly hear Western theory here, right? Past, present, future. And that's my own bias. But we are also looking at attachments. And again, I was hearing that in the earlier panel, that absolutely, what is our attachment to community? What is our ownership and agency in our identity? So these are the things that I think about when I'm thinking of historical trauma. And I think it's really fundamentally different and important to distinguish this from the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And so when we talk about the intergenerational transmission of trauma, I have this chart that I created as I tried to sort through all of the things in my head. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I work with patient populations and I supervise students. And so when I'm working with kids and families, we're often trying to figure out what is the best way to promote healing. Hopefully you can see this, but when we're talking about intergenerational transmission of trauma, it's usually within family systems or community systems. And so there's an assumption that a caregiver has experienced trauma. Now, absolutely, that could be a historical trauma or a collective trauma. But the transmission of that trauma is going to be within that family context. And so different ways of thinking about this. I think there's the pointer, right? Do I have a pointer? Oh, there we go. So insufficient parenting and lack of skills. So we can think about the forced removal of American Indian children into boarding schools, for example. That when we talk about historical trauma, absolutely, loss of parenting is a major factor that comes up. But when we think from the transmission of what's happening, we've lost healthy, adaptive ways of transmitting culture, of transmitting family values, of attaching and having love within a family system. And so when we disrupt that pathway, we're creating a vulnerability for child abuse. We're creating a vulnerability for child's dysregulation, for internalizing and externalizing problems. That's one possible pathway of looking at the intergenerational transmission of trauma through family systems. When we have a caregiver who's been traumatized, we may have post-traumatic stress disorder. We could have a dissociative identity disorder, dissociative experiences happening. Dissociation is this idea of not being able to be present, of zoning out. And so when we have a caregiver who is not able to maintain eye contact with a child, who's not able to express empathy to their child, who's not able to be responsive to their child, particularly when we look at infants, there's incredible lab research to show that when a child needs a parent's attention, a caregiver's attention, within 60 seconds, that child will become incredibly distressed if the caregiver is zoned out. So you may know it if you ever took a psychology class as a still-face paradigm, that when a parent is just simply blank, a baby will immediately go into distress if they cannot elicit some response. And so there's another mechanism of triggering dysregulation in a child, of disrupting attachment. And then we also have things from social learning theory. And so you may know social learning theory as modeling or maybe positive reinforcement. And so when we think about that, we've got a couple different pathways. So if you've got a caregiver who has experienced trauma, then that caregiver is going to have some maladaptive behaviors. And so we can see transmission a couple different ways. And so, push the right button. There we go. So it could be that what a caregiver is modeling for a child is not healthy behaviors. The caregiver is modeling anger. The caregiver is modeling hyper-responsivity. The caregiver could be modeling how to act like you have trauma. And so sometimes what kids learn in terms of normal interrelationships is actually a disruptive psychopathology. Another way that we can transmit trauma is by teaching a child how to act like the world isn't safe. And so even if a child hasn't experienced trauma themselves, this other pathway here, come on, I'm really impaired with using my poker. That last box is that the caregiver could be modeling maladaptive behaviors. And this could be showing a child that you can't trust people and you need to respond in a violent way. So if we model aggression, then the child learns that aggression is normal. That's what they do. They end up eliciting those kinds of responses from teachers. They end up eliciting those kinds of responses from peers. And I know you probably have found this in Jenks with Burmese refugees kids, right? That we can see more fighting, for example. And that could be because of the trauma experiences that parents have. They've actually taught that this is the kids that is the way to act, and then they end up having those behaviors. So in my own work, one of the things I was interested in is, can we really test this model out? And so what we looked at, this was a sample of 60 American Indians in Oregon, we looked at family history of boarding schools. And so people either had no family history that they knew of boarding schools, where a parent or grandparent had not had any time, or they had anywhere from 1 to 24 years in boarding schools. And so what we see here, and now I really need this to work. What? Well, come on. Okay, here we go. So here we have no family history of boarding school. And so what we see is that for American Indians who are in our study, they had, this is statistically similar, high and low betrayal trauma. The betrayal trauma is this notion of interpersonal trauma within a family context. And so we saw relatively similar levels of non-betrayal trauma and high betrayal trauma if there has no family boarding school history. If there was any family boarding school history, any at all, even a single year, we see much higher levels of trauma within the home. But we don't see differences in low betrayal trauma. So we don't see differences in break-ins. We don't see differences in car accidents. We don't see differences in non-interpersonal trauma. So this is a strong argument for the case that interpersonal trauma can be transmitted through these different mechanisms. So in studying this, okay, so trauma is bad, and we know that trauma can beget trauma, but where are the pathways to healing? How can we stop this process of transmission? We know that resilience is malleable. We've got 40 years of resilience research, and the original research told us, the best resilient kids are the ones who were smart enough to pick good parents. So if you are born into a family, preferably that's high SES, white would help. It would help if it was a Christian family as well, living in a good area, definitely college-educated parents, that you would be more resilient, so that's good. But not all the kids make the right choices in choosing their parents. So, what are the ways that we can actually look for other aspects of resilience? And so here's a whole list of things that we know are related to being able to adapt well to adversity, to be able to bounce back, if you will. And so good coping and problem-solving skills, well, heck, we can teach those. Having a good sense of humor, not taking things too seriously. Get a haircut. Attractiveness, believe it or not, being good looking and actually being tall is related to being more resilient. So some of these things are maybe not quite so malleable, but I did try to clean up today. Having meaning in life. One of the things that my lab has looked at is having positive self-perceptions and self-efficacy. Well, self-efficacy, your concept of how well you can handle life, how well you can handle situations. Life experience is going to impact that, but we can also do things to intentionally impact that. When the earlier panelists were talking about the importance of the liberal arts and the performing arts and just kids doing art, as I'm hearing that art is an important part of expression, I'm thinking art is also ownership of your story, and it helps you create a sense of self-efficacy. It can help you tell the narrative that you want to have so that you can have hope. Clinical psychologists, what do we teach our students? Hope. You want to start session 1. We want to instill hope. We have to think there's a road out of here. Having talents valued by society. When Candessa and I were talking, preparing for this panel, it's just such an exciting piece of connection as talking about the importance of art. Oops, and I advanced a little too quickly there. Okay, one of the things my lab has looked at is this idea of resilience through mental toughness. And mental toughness is this notion of confidence, control, commitment, and challenge. And what we have found is that the most resilient people have a sense of control over their lives. They have a sense that no matter what is facing me, I can do it. I can actually impact. I can sort through what I don't have control over, and I can figure out my sense of agency. And they also see change and uncertainty and ambiguity as a challenge instead of a threat. So resiliency, self-efficacy, control, challenge. These are the types of things that we really want to foster when we're looking at healing. Many of you have probably heard about the Asa Study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And the Asa Study really rocked the trauma and psychology world back in 1997 when they found that the number of adverse childhood experiences, things that we may not have thought were traumatic, having a parent who was incarcerated, drug abuse in the home, witnessing domestic violence. There was a time that we didn't think about that as traumatic. That the more ACEs an individual has prior to the age of 18, the earlier they're going to die because of all of these different kinds of diseases that they can have. So one of the things that my lab has looked at is the impact of ACEs on psychological health. And we've looked at these not in clinical populations, but in healthy populations. Because we want to know, so we look at athletes, College athletes, you think about them as pretty resilient, right? Well, actually, they experience a lot of trauma. And in the athlete populations we've looked at, over half have experienced ACEs. And of those who've experienced ACEs, here's from one of our data sets. This is a study of a little over 200 athletes. 91 had experienced at least one ACE, but some of them had experienced lots of ACEs. In this extremely healthy, high-functioning sample, look at these odds ratios. 2.26 times more likely to have an alcohol use disorder. 3.85 times more likely to have a somatization disorder. So that's anxiety, depression, things like that, manifesting in physical symptoms rather than psychological symptoms. 2.28 times more likely to be taking prescription medication. This is in a young adult population. They're 18 to 22 years old. They're not even 60 yet, right? So this is early in adulthood. And the reason I say that 60 is because the original Asa study, the mean age was like in late 50s, early 60s. So that was that comment. I didn't mean to be cute there. Although I'm starting to look at 60 and going, whew. Okay, so ACEs in athletes. Here's the cool piece. There is a mediating variable. When we look at the sense of control, our athletes who had experienced ACEs and had a high sense of control over their lives had fewer or had a less strong relationship with psychopathology that I talked about earlier on the other side. Self-efficacy, sense of control over our stories and over our narratives. So going back to this list of protective factors, we can think about myriad ways that don't have to happen in a therapy room, that don't need to happen with a clinical psychologist in terms of how can we build resilience in kids, how can we build resilience in adults, how can we build resilience in communities. We can look at good coping skills, good problem-solving skills, meaning in life. Another way that my lab has worked is within parenting systems. So in order to prevent intergenerational transmission of trauma, you want to do some parenting stuff, right? And I love kids and I like to work with kids, but it's silly to work with kids without working with the adults in their lives, I think. One of my grad students for her dissertation is in a military family herself and really had a great love for military families. And we know that military families experience a lot of stress, particularly around the deployment cycle. So what we did was look at how well are families doing in the most stressful time of the deployment cycle, which is pre-deployment to just immediately after post-deployment. And can we do something to help? So what Louie did for her dissertation was a 2-session phone intervention with mothers who were at home with a father who was going to be deploying. And we worked with these families to help them prepare their 0 to 6 kids for deployment. And what you see in these bar graphs is the dark blue are the ones that got our parenting phone calls. The other columns are the ones who didn't. They were our control group. We saw incredible responsiveness with knowledge and empowerment. And the way that ended up translating was that, I deleted that slide just to be quick enough, that we saw higher parenting self-efficacy, we saw higher parenting satisfaction, we saw lower levels of kids internalizing and externalizing problems a month after the deployment. So we know that interventions within family systems can be empowering and be really effective. How am I doing for time? Okay. So the last thing, what I want to end on is talking about the narratives. Joanna Davis is here today. She's had 15 years of working with nightmares. She's a magical nightmare person. You have somebody with nightmares, send them to her and she'll take them away. The way she takes them away is through narratives. And we took her treatment and turned it into a kid-friendly treatment. So the kids do art and they draw a picture of their nightmare. And then we change what we want that narrative to be. Sometimes those nightmares are really bad things that really happen to the kids, right? Because these are trauma-related nightmares. And giving the kid the information before they even put crayon to paper, telling them that this is just a story. Yeah, that bad thing happened, and I am really sorry that bad thing happened. I wish that never did. But you're safe now. And that replaying of that story, it's just a story. It might have some basis in truth, but we can change that story. The look on kids' faces when we tell them they can have that agency, when they get permission to change that story. One kid, we accidentally mentioned it in the informed consent. She was 9. She came in, she's like, I don't need your treatment, I changed my story. I'm not joking. We ran her through the treatment anyways, we wanted the data. But she did it all on her own. She didn't need our help. The control of the narrative, it impacts pathways in our brains. The control of the narrative impacts our sense of self-efficacy, our sense of agency. When we talk about the trauma from forced migrations, when we talk about historical trauma, there have been just so many untold atrocities, things that we still don't want to talk about, right? Tulsa's just barely daring to look at the massacre that we call the Tulsa race riots, for example. We're really having trouble facing that. What a trauma clinician will tell you is that avoidance increases your trauma response. If you want to address trauma, we need to be able to face it. Physiologically, as we approach trauma, yeah, we'll have some arousal, but just like everyone who is staring at the TV for hours and hours on end on 9/11, why were we oriented to it? Because it actually down-regulates us. If we put trackers on your physiology, on your eye dilation, on your skin conductance, on your heart rate, as you orient to something that is very distressing to you, your body automatically does this thing called habituation. It down-regulates. But we need to not avoid. We need to face the past and what happens. And then we can also take control of these narratives. When we hear from our next panelists about ways of intervening, it's so important to be thinking about honoring these past stories. What I just love about the art that we're seeing in terms of healing from the past is that it's not only celebrating beautiful artwork, but it's giving agency, it's honoring, it's allowing ownership of culture and identity where previously there was nothing but shame. In a couple weeks, Pierre will be back. Some of us will be back at the Gilcrease because we're celebrating Native American cuisines. The name here is intentional. Initially, it was going to be about food sovereignty. And then we realized we're feeding into a narrative that this is still a marginalized population. We wouldn't call it food sovereignty if we're talking about Italians. Right? We talk about it like Italian cuisines. Let's own the narrative. Let's celebrate. Let's really think about how we want that narrative to be for the individuals who own those narratives. Let's empower them to tell their own stories. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As Jennifer said earlier, my name is Meredith Pearson, and I'm in the second year of my doctoral program at the University of Tulsa. It's really an honor to be here with you all today. I'm really excited to share with you some of my research that I've been doing with the Burmese refugees and kind of give some context to some relevant research and some theory that really goes to inform how we interact with these refugees and what we can do as a community to better support this population. So as I said, I'd like to go just very quickly through my research just to give you kind of a framework, a practical application, if you will, to be able to talk about some of these very important issues. And then I also really want to touch on this piece of where do we go from here? Now that we have this information, what do we do with it? So first of all, for those of you who don't know, Burma is right over in this little corner of the world. You may also know it as Myanmar. So this title was given a couple of decades ago, and it is a reflection of the dictatorship of the Republic of Myanmar. And so something that's important to note with these individuals in particular is that it is very empathetic and culturally sensitive to refer to it as Burma. You'll often hear these individuals from this area referring to it as Burma as a lack of acknowledgement of the military dictatorship that is there. Just an important piece to note. Now, in terms of a few numbers, I don't want to overwhelm you with the numbers, but I do want to point this out because I think that there is a lack of understanding about how prominent this population is here in Tulsa. So these numbers are from 2016. These are the latest available statistics, so these numbers have increased recently. But as of 2016, there were about 6,000 Burmese Zomi refugees in the Tulsa area. And Zomi is just referring to what part of Burma they originated from. At this time, they were estimating about 350 new individuals were coming each year. And the individuals that have been coming over more recently are family members of those who sought refuge here several years ago. So those in the Tulsa area, they go as far back as a decade ago when they first started coming over here. And important to note is that there are over 1,000 students in the Jinx Public Schools District that are Burmese refugees. And this is really the basis of why this research has been important to me and why I've been focusing on it. It's because there is such a huge population in our schools. And this kind of needs assessment hasn't been done yet. So this is just a brief overview of some of the things that we were interested in. The core of it was that we wanted to understand what are the interactions like between the refugees and the school staff. So we wanted to know what were communications with teachers like? How were they interacting with the staff? Were they getting their questions answered? Did they feel supported? And importantly, how are the children doing? Were they performing well in school? Were there opportunities for us to better support this community and ensure student success? Now, we found a lot of different things, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to highlight one. So one of the important things that we found is that the refugees who have been here for a less amount of time are actually more hesitant to ask for help from the school staff. Now, this seems like it could be kind of an unimportant piece, but it's actually really central to this idea of barriers to information. So something I'm going to talk about in just a moment when I get into some of the other research is that individuals within a refugee community in particular are more likely to seek help from others in their community. This is not a bad thing, but it becomes problematic when that information is not accurate. And it's additionally problematic whenever they don't feel as though they can go to those who are in authority. There is this authority barrier to information. There's a fear, there is a reluctance to ask questions, and this is a problem because it reinforces this idea of you don't belong here, you do not have a place. And this is not always intentional. I by no means want to make that what you hear from this presentation, but rather that this is an area for us to really support refugees. And the flip side of this is that those who have been in the United States for longer, you're going to see higher rates of student success. You're going to see higher rates of the structural assimilation, this idea that they are really integrated into the school system, into the community. And this leads to psychological well-being. So kiddos are going to report being happier, being more well-adjusted, having a fuller sense of life, and their parents as well. Now, as I mentioned, there are a couple of theoretical orientations that I'd like to discuss today. So I mentioned structural assimilation just a moment ago, and this is from a theory that was proposed by Gordon in the 1960s. And he basically said there are two types of assimilation. The first is behavioral assimilation. And so behavioral assimilation is really that surface level, I understand the culture enough to get by. I know what I'm doing, I can walk the walk, I can talk the talk, but I don't really feel a sense of belongingness here. And this type of assimilation results in secondary relationships. And this is talking about the relationship of the refugees to the members of this, of the country that they are seeking refuge in. Now, the secondary relationships are problematic in that they reinforce this idea, you don't belong here, you don't have a place. I'm not saying that all secondary relationships are problematic, but just that if those are the only relationships that they have with individuals outside of their community, it really reinforces this idea of, like I said, you don't belong here. And Gordon did posit that this was the most common type of assimilation in America. This was back in the 1960s, and I would propose to you today that it's still the case. Now, on the opposite side is structural assimilation. And Gordon would say that this is actually our goal for refugees in the community. Structural assimilation is when you are actually interwoven into the very fabric of society, when you feel as though, yes, you still have your ties to your refugee community, to the place from which you came, but you also have a sense of belonging. You have a sense of purpose in your refugee, or in the country where you're seeking refuge. This is going to have amazing ramifications such as psychological well-being, greater happiness, less loneliness, things like that. And like I said, this is the ideal goal for refugees. The reason that I bring this up is because I think it's important to be looking at those relationships. Are we having only secondary relationships with these individuals, or are we really looking for full integration? Are we really looking to go deeper and to really establish those deeper relationships? The other piece of theory that I wanted to bring up was proposed by Kunz in the 1970s, so we're jumping forward a decade. And Kunz talked about this idea of push and pull factors. And this is really going to be the distinction between the different types of migrants. So forced migrants, we're going to see that there's a stronger push away from their home country. That is really their motivation to flee. So they're going to be leaving things like poverty and oppression, fear, disaster, dictatorships, things like that. For these individuals, the push to leave is so overwhelming. Conversely, voluntary migrants, you're going to see a stronger pull towards the new country. So these are the individuals that are going to leave their countries in pursuit of finding opportunity, stability, freedom, safety. Now, forced migrants may recognize that the place that they are going, there will be more opportunity, there might be more stability, but the key point here is that for forced migrants, that push factor is so overwhelming, it overshadows anything else. And the other piece of this theory that I'd like to present is this idea of a vintage. So a vintage is simply a group of refugees that depart from their home country at the same time. Now, why am I bringing this up? Why is this important? Because I think that it has really important implications when you're dealing with these populations. So you might have a group from a particular vintage that thinks, I need to leave now, I need to leave sooner because I need to leave before things get any worse. Now, you might have another group that would leave 5, 10 years later that thought, no, we really need to remain in our home country before we leave a little bit longer. We're going to stick it out. We're going to see if we can work to put things back together, or there are a myriad of different reasons for this. But the reason I bring this up is because there's a conflict between these vintages. That based on the time from when you depart from your country of origin and you are fleeing, I'm talking specifically about forced migrants here, when you are fleeing from an oppressive community, from a dangerous situation, that there is a heterogeneity within the groups. So we have this tendency to see the title Burmese refugees, and we think that they've all had the same experience, but it's not true. Their interaction within their community is going to be different. They may be seeking judgment, they may be experiencing judgment or any kind of persecution from within their own group based on when they decided to leave their country. And this is something that we don't often think about. We think about the outsiders of the group, those who are in the country that they are seeking refuge in, as oppressing them or as having discrimination or prejudicial views. But there are actually those kind of views within the refugee community based on these kind of political opinions and really particularly when they decide to leave. So where do we go from here? And this is the piece that I'd really like to camp out on for a little while. I really want to encourage, and I think that this is something that we often say in these kinds of areas, but I really want to encourage you to think about this, is this idea of acquiring cultural competence. Are you really being very knowledgeable about this culture where these individuals are coming from? Are you seeing them as a group of individuals that have had the same experience, that they are the same on the surface, or are you looking beyond that? Are you looking at how they've interacted with their culture, how that culture is interacting with their new culture, and the distress that's associated with that? What are you doing to recognize that, to validate that, and to be compassionate towards it? And also this idea of acknowledging and partnering with Indigenous leaders. So this is something that's particularly important with the Burmese community here in Tulsa, but I would argue that it's important with other communities as well with cultural differences. Since we do know that they are hesitant to seek informational support from individuals outside of their community, it's really key to partner with that community. So a good example of this is from my research. A lot of the students and their parents were saying that they would go to the interpreters for help. Well, the interpreters didn't always have the right information, and so parents would walk away and be so confused, not knowing what was going on in the schools, not knowing even what grades their kids were making. I had one parent who said, well, I know in the American school system they have A's and B's and C's and D's, but I don't know what any of it means. I mean, I think they're doing okay, and just not understanding those little nuances produced a lot of distress for them. It kind of reinforces this idea of, I don't know what's going on, and do I really have a place here? So I say this to say one very practical way in which we can address this barrier is for those individuals who are leaders in the community, the pastors in the Burmese churches, the interpreters that are in the schools, really partnering with them and making sure that they have accurate information and that accurate information is getting to the refugees. And like Dr. Cromer said, this idea of promoting individual adaptation, resilience, and strengths, this is so key, and I won't belabor this since Dr. Cromer touched on it so wonderfully, but this is so essential. And again, this idea of increasing informational support. There's already a barrier in place in knowing that you are not in that refugee community, and those individuals are likely to see you as an authority, and because of that, there's going to be barriers there. It's going to feel as though it is rude to question, as though they're unable to reach out and say, hey, I'm confused, I don't know what's going on. And so really making sure that you're providing those opportunities. And this final piece, this is something that really struck me in the process of my interviews with the Burmese refugees and doing the needs assessment, is this idea of not using an interpreter in the appropriate way. So you would have a lot of the school staff who would talk to the interpreter but not talk to the individual that they were actually conversing with. So it's this idea of you have three people in the room, you have yourself, the refugee, and the interpreter, and you're really carrying on the conversation with the interpreter. And it would be as if I'm giving my talk over here to the panelists and I never even look at you all. There's no connection, there's no mutual understanding, there's not a shared experience. And this can lead to a lot of distress. If you're in a situation where you don't know the language, that already is a barrier, and then you add to it, oh yes, I have this interpreter, great, I finally have a way to communicate, but then I don't really actually connect with the person. They're just talking to the interpreter. So I belabor that, but the point is that, sorry, I didn't realize that had slipped away. The point is that we really need to be knowledgeable when we do have interpreters. How are we utilizing them, and are we utilizing them as a tool to connect with the individual, or are we using them as a crutch? And so, as Dr. Cromer said, we're going to save questions to the end, but I did just want to put this slide up just so that you had my email if you had any questions or anything like that, and we didn't get a chance to cover that later. But thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate your time.
OCO. Ni ga ni jiwi OCO. Oh, stai OCO. Wadon. Candessa Tehee dawado yone siwo dawado jalog ia go se hon. Jihela dikalaga. Ska dugi jun det lo quast dagi lo stane ho. Jalagi gawoni histing. Di de yohesk aseno. Jalagi gawoni histing uska nola geke del kwan. Ji de college jalagi ani wahai digiyawi. Kali heliga jije donha. In English, my name's Candessa Tehee, and in Cherokee, my name is something else, but everybody calls me Pumpkin. I'm a full-blood Cherokee. I work at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, and I teach Cherokee language, but I'm learning Cherokee slowly. But I always try, and I stand strong. I think it's important to bring language everywhere I go, because without our language, we don't have a way to talk to God in the way that He gave us. I'm honored to have been included in this discussion on historical trauma and forced migration. I'm honored to be here with these panelists, and I'm happy to see all of you today. Every time I'm invited to the Helmerich Center for American Research or Gilcrease Museum, good things happen. So I'm happy to be here. So today, I am going to talk about removal and resilience, contemporary Southeastern Indian art, confronting histories of forced migration. Oh, whoa. Wait, that was right, I think. No, it wasn't. Okay, it'll be okay. I am going to analyze the ways in which contemporary Southeastern Indian artists confront histories of forced migration, but first I'm going to begin by briefly outlining the history of Southeastern Indian removal. And because I am a Cherokee woman, I necessarily have a specific emphasis on Cherokee history and Cherokee forced migration. And I'm going to start out with a disclaimer. I recently returned from a trip to North Carolina with a group of 11, 9 students, myself, and another instructor at Northeastern State University as part of a Cherokee Lifeways class. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about today, I may become emotional whenever I talk about them. I'll endeavor to do my best to not do that. But it's still very fresh to me because I just got back on Wednesday. So in the early 19th century, with ruthless efficiency, the U.S. government enacted a staggering ethnic cleansing in what is currently the southeastern United States. Indian removal occurred for the Muskogee, the Seminole, the Chickasha, the Chata, Yuchi, Nachi, and my people, the Guduwagi people. It occurred throughout the Southeast, with Indians from other geographic regions also being sent to Indian Territory. Choctaw writer Leanne Howe has spoken of how the knowledge of how to urinate as a female while standing up was passed down among women in her family, because during removal, the ability to urinate while standing was needed for survival. Cherokee language teacher Tom Belt spoke about how when he was a child that, you remember when it was a fashion that people would decorate with wooden spoons and wooden forks hanging like in the kitchen, that someone in the family brought this home and his grandfather took it and threw it away immediately because it reminded him of the time when they arrived after the trail and they had nothing. And they carved eating utensils from wood because that was the only way they would have utensils. And those wooden utensil decorations reminded him of that time and of that pain. My friend Jennifer Johnson, Seminole language activist, shared with me her story when she visited Florida for the first time. And she was told stories of how Seminole people hid in shallow waters, breathing through reeds to hide from the soldiers hunting them. Although the small children they had with them were unable to breathe through the reeds. Today, 39 American Indian nations are within what is currently Oklahoma. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed at the behest of President Andrew Jackson. And while Jackson rightfully is associated with this heinous act and is vilified among Cherokee people through artwork, such as this ink-on-board piece by artist Roy Boney Jr., Kani Kolaha, depicting a zombified and perhaps a soulless incarnation of Jackson. The steps toward Southeastern Indian removal began as early as Thomas Jefferson's presidency and was ultimately carried to fruition by Marton Van Buren, spanning 6 presidents and over 40 years. This process led to much tumult among indigenous nations. Within the Cherokee Nation, there was severe disagreement over the course of action to be taken. A group of men took it upon themselves to sign the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding the eastern homelands, although land cessions were forbidden and would be a death warrant for any signatories. Elias Boudinot is quoted in a pamphlet address We cannot conceive of the acts of a minority to be so reprehensible and unjust as are represented by Mr. Ross. If 100 persons are ignorant of their true situation and are so completely blinded as not to see the destruction that awaits them, we can see strong reasons to justify the actions of a minority of 50 persons to do what the majority would do if they understood their condition, to save a nation from political thraldom and moral degradation. Boudinot is completely certain that his and the other signers of the Treaty of New Echota their signatures were saving the Cherokee Nation from ruination. But on the other side of the issue, Chief John Ross was continuing to encourage Cherokees in the East to plant their crops until 1838, when soldiers began rounding Cherokees up into stockades. The background image used in this slide and throughout this presentation is of a protest signed by Cherokees who were actively trying to resist removal. These sheets were signed in the syllabary, or an X was made with their name written next to it. The sheets were fastened end to end and rolled into a large scroll and sent to Washington to fight removal. Yet, despite these efforts, removal did occur. The image here is Tom Belt, a Cherokee language instructor at Western Carolina University, outside what is currently, and I think it's important to say what is currently, not what is now, so that way we acknowledge the temporality of the nation state in which we stand. In what is currently Robbinsville, North Carolina, where Fort Hembry was built specifically for Cherokee internment. Though it no longer stands, Mr. Belt is pointing at the trail down the mountains because soldiers cleared a path, cutting down trees, so Cherokees would go straight down and straight up the mountain instead of taking the road, because that would have taken too long for removal. This oil on wood image by Kay Walkingstick is titled Farewell to the Smokies. It captures this moment as the artist envisioned it. Recently, the traveling exhibition, Return from Exile, is confronting these painful histories. The traveling exhibition has visited Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Arkansas, Florida, Tennessee, and is ending its run in North Carolina later this year. The exhibition features 40 works by 32 contemporary Southeastern artists in a variety of mediums and has 3 themes: removal, return, and resilience. Depicted here are 10 of the exhibition artists, the 3 curators, and 2 of the speakers who were present for the opening symposium at the Linden House in Athens, Georgia in 2015. And this is Benjamin Harjo's piece, which is featured in the show, titled The Age... Ooh, sorry. You want to look at these, right? I think I hit this...
I think we get the slideshow on the next.
Wait. There we go. Yeah. I paused it. I hit something. Yeah.
It's a different kind of migration taking.
Well, because I don't have the time. Yeah, I know I don't have the time. Maybe I may have hit this. Okay, right, next one. That one. Yeah, that's where I'm at. Okay.
Yeah, you do have them timed.
How do I have them timed? Okay, so that concludes my presentation. Okay, so this is Benjamin Harjo's piece, and it's titled, I think my mic went out too. Maybe I was not supposed to give this presentation. That could be it. Yeah, it did. Because it's blinking red and it's got the battery light on.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think this works. Can everyone hear me okay? Resilience, absolutely. I wanted to embody that theme really, really deeply, and I think it worked. So this is Benjamin Harjo's piece, and it's titled The Aegis Sacrifice. Harjo stated that this piece was actually inspired by an out-of-focus slide of a cathedral that the artist found in an estate sale, and he actually viewed it upside down. But when he looked at that upside-down cathedral, this was the image that came to his mind. It includes Seminole patchwork patterns and a snake image that was inspired by a legend among the Seminole that rattlesnakes should not be harmed, and it's titled The Aegis Sacrifice. Over the years, many people have sacrificed in different ways in their removal from the homelands to Oklahoma, but those sacrifices is how Seminole culture and ceremonies have continued on today. And when you recall that story I shared with you from Jennifer Johnson, my friend who's a language activist, the resonance of what those sacrifices were takes on a new meaning. This is Troy Jackson's piece. It's a ceramic and steel sculpture, and it's titled A Driven Force. Jackson says the piece symbolizes the greed and social injustice caused by man himself, and that when given time, this injustice becomes a machine with few boundaries and even fewer ethics. This piece reflects the industrial and destructive nature of Indian removal. However, resilience is also reflected here because, as you can see in the detail there that's inset, it's also inscribed with Southeastern symbolism and fused with that industrialism. And according to the artist, this marriage between industrialism and Southeastern symbolism it is evocative of Southeastern Indian people's continuance and perseverance, that rather than becoming part of the machine or becoming destroyed by the machine, they have persevered. We have persevered as a people with an intact culture. Next is a textile sculpture from Chickasaw Choctaw artist Margaret Wheeler. Margaret was invited to participate in the Return from Exile exhibition, and she chose to hand weave this material from cotton thread and then applied glass beads and brass bells. The textile sculpture also contains references to Mississippian symbolism in the pieces beaded by Wheeler that serve as a bridle and gorget, and in the brass bells that were custom made by Chickasaw artists, they also feature Mississippian symbolism. This piece is in honor of the Chickasaw horse. The Chickasaw horse was a highly prized horse, and unfortunately it is extinct at this time. However, when the artist was researching, she found that, and she at first thought this didn't tie in with the theme of resilience. And then through further research, she found that the Chickasaw horse was actually bred into the into the lines of the American quarter horse. So therefore, in addition to resilience through the trials and tribulations of forced removal, the Chickasaw horse survived by transforming to become part of a new being, and thereby truly embodying both resilience and renewal. And Margaret's work, if you can see it in person, it is truly phenomenal. The exhibition is currently at the University of North Carolina, Pembroke. The penultimate image that I include for your analysis is from the Eastern Bend Cherokee artist Shan Gosshorn, and I'm sure many people know Shan's work. Shan is a dear friend of mine, and she's gained international acclaim for her innovative work that combines hand-tinted paper splints with archival images and historical documents in the double weave style baskets, which have been created for generations by Cherokee people. This double weave style, when it's done properly, you can't tell where it begins and ends. So Gosshorn has an impactful innovation in using the style to seamlessly blend photography and archival documents. In the pieces depicted here, Gosshorn states she is invoking the duality of place for Cherokee people who have created a new homeland in what is currently Oklahoma, but are still tied to the homelands in the east, which we in Oklahoma call Tlaguit, or it's like old Cherokee nation. Both baskets use the Indian Removal Act of 1830, while an image of a woman sitting by a river in the east is used on the basket in the left. An image of a woman standing in front of an Oklahoma landscape is used in the basket on the right. This connection across geography, across time, between Eastern and Western Cherokee people was not diminished by the legislation and greed of the colonizers. And in this final image from Return from Exile, Gosshorn uses her photography in a piece titled Self-Portrait. She portrays our intimate connection with the land. Cherokee people are often called Jalagi. Cherokee people also call themselves Anayawia'i, or the principal people. But yet another name for ourselves is Gadua, or Anigaduwagi. Recently, I learned that Gadua comes from the words for gada, dirt, and uha, which is like he or she has it. So the connection implicit in Gosshorn's piece reflects this unbreakable connection to the land. Or as I was told when we arrived in North Carolina, welcome home, because we as Cherokees are part of the land, and that land is a part of us, whether they sent us to Oklahoma or not. Therefore, although Gosshorn is Eastern Cherokee and her ancestors were not driven out as part of the forced removal, she too experienced its legacy when we in the West were taken over. As part of the Return from Exile exhibition, there are several print actions that take place, and included here are photos from 3 of the print actions. That one's from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I think we're at Aha. This one is in London, England, and it was at the American Indian Workshop, which was at Goldsmiths University there in London. And this one is from the Cherokee Heritage Center in Park Hill, Oklahoma at the, during the Return from Exile exhibition while it was at the Cherokee Heritage Center. And then finally, with the print actions, we have Margaret Wheeler holding the poster that is featuring her artwork there. The print actions are an important piece of the Return from Exile exhibitions because it is bringing artwork straight to people. It's bringing it, oftentimes, you know, I'm an artist and I make works, but oftentimes I'm told by people, I would love to buy something from you, but I can't afford it. And oftentimes the artists who are part of these exhibitions hear that as well. But we make art to represent our experiences and as a collective moment of healing for our communities. So these print actions are a way to get this artwork directly in the hands of the people who are most intimately tied and most intimately connected to it. And this is a quote from Wilma Mankiller. She said, "You can't see the future through tear-filled eyes." And it ties directly into comments from other panelists here today. And I'll let you make your own meaning for her words there. And I know I'm between you and lunch, but this is my last image, I swear. And this is an image of us at Katua Mound. And this was taken on Sunday morning. We went to Katua Mound because we wanted to experience it there in the quiet with no one else there. At Katua Mound, it's the mother town. They have always told me that there's a fire that burns there that will never go out, that represents Cherokee ceremonialism. And I spoke with an archaeologist there, Dr. Breck Riggs, and he said that they have taken scientific equipment and they have detected a heat signature where the altar is at Katua Mound. And the reason why is because it was so intensely fired for so many generations that it magnetized the ground. It changed the composition of the earth. Cherokee people did. The belief did. And he also told me that the path from that altar to the river can still be discerned. And this is a photograph of me and some of the students taking that path from that altar to the river that so many of our ancestors took generations ago and continue to take. So when I stand here and talk about renewal, continuation, and resilience, it's happening in our Southeastern Indian communities. Jisquadan, I'm done.
So we have time for a few questions before we break for lunch. Thank you again for just really fabulous presentation, panel, really thought-provoking. So we open up the panel, open up the audience for questions and observations. So we had a couple of conversations here, last two papers, that were speaking about resilience and you might use one term, cultural competency, but also interwoven in that ideas of assimilation and that are felt and described rather differently. And so I wonder if our panelists can kind of ruminate on that, because in the Burmese case, we're speaking of assimilation as productive of belonging, right? And as a means by which children from other places find a place. But assimilation carries a rather different resonance in Native communities that relates to, a fundamentally different process that really would be difficult to describe as healthy, as uplifting. And so maybe to the extent that you're comfortable doing, sort of think about what I see as kind of the paradox inside that word, right? When we talk about recovery, renewal, and things of that sort. So begin.
I'll take a stab at that. So from the psychological literature, when we look at immigrants, we see that immigrants typically do fairly well. It's the children of immigrants that don't. And so when we look at high levels of psychopathology, and so the way we might understand that is balancing two worlds and living in two worlds and having difficulty coping with two worlds. But there's a fundamental difference when we're looking at forced migration and complete disempowerment versus some elected process. And arguably refugees absolutely experience some forced migration, but there's also an elective process in there. There is a sense of agency, and so I think there is a fundamental difference. Yeah. Do you want to say anything else?
Is this turned on? I think it's... Is this turned on? Nope, it's not. I will grab this one. Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I think that Dr. Cromer makes a really good point here, is that we are looking at a very different population, and I'm speaking, with my presentation, I think that I was speaking more to what we can do in terms of bridging the gap between the refugee community and our community, and what we can do to make those relationships more productive. And I in no way mean to imply that the Burmese culture should in any way be wiped away, that it should be in any way disregarded, but rather that it should be celebrated and acknowledged, and that where opportunities for integration of relationships are possible, that those are capitalized upon.
Other questions?
I don't know if anybody's actually spoke about this, but my understanding of post-traumatic stress and whether it reaches culturally, family, individually, is that there's a genetic thumbprint that's placed on and passed down. And I certainly feel it when I see both the Native American and the Black community here. Being 70 years old, you know, I've seen some generations. So you still have a very deep, painful feel about all this, and it has to be handed down genetically.
I really appreciate your question, and I would also like to point out that oftentimes there's an erasure of Black Indian experiences in Indian country, and it's a really unfortunate symptom of, I think, the larger trend of anti-Blackness in mainstream U.S. society. So I feel that it's important at this point to note that when we're talking about, or when I'm talking about removal and resilience, and I unfortunately didn't frame this very well, I don't think, is that there was also lateral oppression that was occurring during removal as well, in which enslaved peoples were also forced along on the trail as well, on that forced migration. And I think it's important to name that and to say those things, and also keep in mind that many of the elite power brokers in Cherokee Nation at the time were also slave owners. And so the owning of enslaved peoples and that lateral oppression that was visited by Cherokee people on other less privileged individuals in their midst is important to note as well. I didn't have any further comment beyond that.
I read the, I'll speak up. I read the quote by Will Mankiller, "You can't see the future through tear-filled eyes," but yet we speak of resiliency. How do we integrate the two?
I think it's lunchtime, because that's a tough question. In the way that quote was presented to me, they said that we can't forget the past, and we can't forget the struggles, and we can't forget the pain that our people experienced, because that legacy lives with us. We are still in a new homeland. We're still in Oklahoma. We're still fighting to revitalize our language. We're fighting for space for our culture, for our religion, for our ceremony, for our very ways of being in this world. And of course we're sad about the past, and of course when we make these moments of connection with these historical traumas, and we have to deal with that, and we have to acknowledge them, and we have to do so in a manner that's productive and community building rather than getting lost in the lament of what occurred. And that's kind of the way, and I know I got really emotional during my presentation, but ultimately all of this is not about living in the past. It's about carrying that with us and being self-aware of how, and being aware as a community of how it's impacted us, so that way we can address those hurts and address those pains and heal our communities.
And if I may, I think that's lovely. I think there's a time for tears, and I don't see that quote, and it's not for me to interpret, but my interpretation of it, the way I see it as someone who works with patients, who sees herself as a healer, is that it is absolutely important through ceremonies, through rituals, through relationships, to honor time for tears. And that is a time for healing. And when we're healing, I think that we're present in the moment. We aren't moving forward yet. And that those can happen in contiguity.
Yes, and then I'd just also like to add that I think that, my talk focused more on what we as a community can do to support those individuals, and I think that what both of these panelists have been talking about is this idea of honoring the hurt, sitting with it, acknowledging it, and owning it, and I think that we as a community can also rally around those refugees and, the Native American community, whatever that is, rally around them in a way that we are by no means owning their hurt, but we are acknowledging it, and we are sitting alongside. I think that that's something that we as a community don't often do a good job of. I think it's an area for growth, and it's something that I see in the school district a lot, just in my work with the Burmese refugees, that there's acknowledgement of hurt, but it is only from a factual standpoint. So yes, they've experienced trauma, yes, bad things have happened, but do you really go deeper with it? So.
Hi. Well, I want to thank you all for your diverse presentations, and I recognized a lot of kind of parallel conversations happening here. You're talking about resilience, healing, assimilation, acculturation, but I was wondering for each of you what the role of creation or ethnogenesis, new culture, new ways of being, what role those ideas play in your discussion of resilience, assimilation. So what about the new?
Well, having recently gotten back from North Carolina, my students were doing an ethnobotanical survey, and they were looking at the usage of plants among Eastern and Western Cherokee. And something that we found was that, for instance, in North Carolina, they have wasp, and they call them ramps. But in Oklahoma, we don't have wasp. We have sug inagae, and that is wild onions. But wild onions are very similar to ramps, and they come out during the same moment in the year. And there are other plants that have those same similarities. We have some of the similar flora and fauna, but it's those plants that we don't have here in Oklahoma that we found stand-ins for. And in some cases, we call by the same names that we call the plant that doesn't exist here in Oklahoma that they call in North Carolina. So that is, maybe that's too tangible or too concrete a representation of culture creation, but we are so tied to the land for us to have been completely transplanted here and to be missing some elements of flora that are necessary for our survival and necessary for Nawot. Because wasp, it lowers blood pressure. And so doctors in North Carolina around this time of year have to be sure they're taking that into account when they're consulting and advising with their patients. So So, I'm not quite sure if that may have been what you were asking about, but at this point in time, there is an exchange that happens between North Carolina and Oklahoma where they give us wasp and we give them sug in the gay, because it's a cultural exchange through flora.
I smile as you say that, because as I was thinking about an answer to the question, I immediately went to the old growth forests of British Columbia, which is where I've spent some time as a younger person. And I don't know what new is, but I know what renewal is. I've seen clear cuts, I've seen land that's just been decimated, and then I've seen how the land revives. And I see that in the human condition as well. I think there's just something so beautiful about a 1,000-year-old tree that's rooted on another fallen 1,000-year-old tree that's really 2,000 years old. And so is that new growth or is that renewal? And so I think a lot about this cyclical process as we talk about all of this, that I don't know, maybe I'm being difficult, but I don't know what to call new. I think that culture is alive. Culture constantly is changing and culture constantly is growing. If we try to nail it down, you can't nail a wave on the sand, right? And that's how I see culture and language. Our language is constantly changing, and what I understand from my colleagues who study language is that the people who are changing it are the 14 and 15-year-olds. By the time you're 19 or 20, you're old, and so that says so much about the intensity of change, I think. And so if I would just offer the renewal.
And I think that I come from a little bit of a different perspective on this, because with my research and the individuals that I've been speaking with, everything is new. They're uprooted and put into a new situation. Everything is unfamiliar. Everything is unknown and confusing. And so new within particularly the Burmese refugee community, I think, is a sense of normalcy. I think it's a sense of stability and a sense of belonging.
I just have one last thing to say. As I work with Meredith, and one of the things that's been so wonderful about Jenks Public Schools is that they are coming to us in the psychology department at TU and wanting to know what they can do to help, how they can be more trauma-informed in their schools. And this is one of the first steps, is that needs assessment to figure out what they can do to provide that support between the refugee population and the students and the teachers and the administration. And so it's such a great thing and a great step for them to be aware of that. So I just wanted to make sure that we all knew that too, that Jenks is a super advocate for that piece.
Yes, and thank you for pointing that out. And a lot of the, so they've already had interpreters there, just to add this other piece, they've already had interpreters there for many years, and so they are taking steps, sorry I didn't make this clear in my presentation, they are taking steps to accommodate these families. There's just limited knowledge in terms of other specifics beyond interpretation and beyond these other accommodations. So thank you for adding that.
So I know that we have to move along to lunch, so I just want to thank our panelists again for these amazing presentations.